My name is Arthur Vance. I'm 62 now, but this happened 4 years ago, in the late fall of my 58th year. For 35 years, I worked for the Army Corps of Engineers. My job was infrastructure. I designed and oversaw the construction of things in difficult places, remote access roads, small dams in unforgiving terrain, observation posts on lonely mountaintops. I understand stress, I understand physics, and I understand the wild. I spent my life taming small corners of it, or at least creating pockets where people could exist safely within it. I'm a rational man. I believe in blueprints and load-bearing capacities and the predictable behavior of materials. I tell you this so you understand that I am not given to fantasy. I am not a man who sees shapes in the shadows. After I retired, I kept the cabin my father built in the Superior National Forest up in northern Minnesota. It's not a lakeside cottage for summer tourists. It's deep, miles down a gravel road that turns to a muddy track, which is exactly how I liked it. It was my sanctuary, a place of profound silence and order. The cabin is solid, built of hand-hewn cedar logs on a fieldstone foundation. I'd modernized it myself over the years, solar panels for electricity, a deep well for water, and reinforced storm shutters on the windows. It was my fortress. My nearest neighbor was my friend Cal Peterson, whose own cabin was about a quarter-mile through the dense pine and birch woods. We were the only two outposts on that particular spur of the forest. That October was the last trip of the season. The purpose was to winterize the cabins, drain the pipes, board up the more exposed windows, and haul out anything that might attract animals. Cal came up with me, and he brought his nephew, Brian, a kid in his early 20s who thought the woods were a great place to get away from cell service and drink beer. Cal's daughter, Alyssa, also came along. She was a quiet girl, a student at the university, and she just wanted to see the fall colors one last time before the snows came. It was a familiar routine, the kind of comfortable, end-of-season ritual we'd done for a decade. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. The loons had already gone south. The woods were settling into that deep, pre-winter quiet. The first day was completely normal. We worked on Cal's cabin first, the 4 of us forming an efficient little team. Brian, for all his city-bred sarcasm, was a strong kid and did the heavy lifting without complaint. Alyssa helped her dad with the plumbing, and I went around securing the shutters. By late afternoon, we were done. We drove my old pickup truck back to my place, where we planned to stay for the next 2 nights while we finished my winterization. The mood was light.
Cal and I were telling old stories. Brian was making jokes about wanting to see a moose, and Alyssa was taking pictures of the sunset filtering through the skeletal branches of the birch trees. We had a big dinner, stew and crusty bread. The wood stove was humming, casting a warm orange glow across the main room. Outside, the temperature was dropping fast. The wind was picking up, a low moan through the tops of the pines. It was a comforting, familiar sound. Around 9 o'clock, Brian got up and said he was going to grab another beer from the cooler in the truck. He stepped outside, and the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. He was gone for maybe 30 seconds. When he came back in, he left the door ajar and stood there, looking out into the impenetrable blackness of the yard. "Hey, Art," he said, his voice casual but with an odd note in it. "You got some weird neighbors out here." Cal looked up from his coffee. "What are you talking about, Bri?" "I don't know." "Heard something," he said, shrugging. He came back to the table, a couple of beers in his hand. Sounded like someone knocking on a tree, like a real rhythmic knock. Thump, thump, thump. Then a pause. Then again.
I stopped stirring my own coffee. I knew every sound these woods could make. I knew the hollow drumming of a woodpecker, the territorial grunt of a buck, the way a falling branch could crack like a rifle shot. A rhythmic knocking was not on the list. Probably a woodpecker working late, I said, offering the most logical explanation I could find. At night? In the dark? Brian countered, popping the cap off his beer. And it was heavy. It sounded like someone hitting a tree with a baseball bat. Cal chuckled. It's the woods, kid. It plays tricks on you. Probably just the wind. But he glanced at me, a silent question in his eyes. He knew I'd spent more time out here than anyone. I just gave a slight shake of my head. I had no explanation that fit. We dropped it, but the seed was planted. The comfortable silence of the cabin felt a little different now. It felt less like a sanctuary and more like a bubble of light and warmth in an overwhelming darkness. The moan of the wind no longer sounded quite so comforting. Later that night, after everyone had turned in, I was lying awake on my cot. The others were in the loft. I couldn't sleep. Brian's words kept replaying in my head. Thump, thump, thump. It was such a specific, unnatural description. I listened to the sounds of the cabin settling, the groan of wood, the whisper of the dying fire in the stove. And then I heard it. It wasn't the knocking Brian had described. It was a scraping sound. It came from the north wall of the cabin, the one that faced the deepest part of the forest. It was a slow, deliberate sound. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Like a heavy garden rake being dragged across the cedar logs. My blood went cold. My first thought was a bear, a big, black bear, maybe rubbing its back against the wall or clawing at the wood. But the sound was too methodical. It wasn't the frantic, animalistic scratching of a hungry predator. It was patient. It went on for a full minute, a steady, rhythmic scraping that set my teeth on edge. Then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped. I lay there for what felt like an hour, every muscle tensed, straining to hear. Nothing. Just the wind. I didn't get up. I didn't go to the window. Rule 1 of being in the wild is you don't investigate strange things in the dark. You wait for the sun. The sun is your friend. The darkness belongs to everything else. I finally drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. The memory of that sound etched into my mind. The next morning, I was the first one up. Before the coffee was even brewing, I grabbed my heavy mag light and went outside. The air was frigid, my breath pluming in front of my face. I walked around to the north wall, my boots crunching on the frosted ground. I ran my hand over the logs where I'd heard the sound. Nothing. No claw marks, no tufts of fur, no sign of anything. I crouched down, examining the ground. The frost made it hard to see any clear prints, but there was no disturbed earth, no broken twigs. It was as if nothing had been there. When Cal came down, I told him what I'd heard. He was a practical man, an electrician by trade, much like me in his thinking. He listened intently, his brow furrowed. Scraping. And no marks? He asked, pulling on his jacket. None that I can find, I said. It doesn't make sense. A bear big enough to make that sound would have left a mark on the wood. It would have torn up the ground. Maybe it was ice falling from the roof, he offered, but he didn't sound convinced. It wasn't from the roof, Cal. It was from the wall, midway up. We decided to take a walk around the property line just to see if we could find anything out of the ordinary. Brian and Alyssa were still asleep. We walked slowly, our eyes scanning the forest floor. About 100 yards from the cabin, near the edge of a small clearing, we found it. It was a doe, or what was left of one. It wasn't a clean kill. It wasn't the work of wolves, which would have eaten their fill and left a scattered but understandable carcass.
It wasn't the work of a bear, which would have mauled it and likely tried to bury the remains. This was different. This was violent. The animal had been torn in half. The sheer force required to do that was staggering. The two halves were separated by about 10 feet, as if whatever killed it had ripped it apart and then simply discarded the pieces. There were no feeding marks, no entrails pulled out. It was just destroyed. It was an act of rage, not hunger. "My God," Cal whispered, his face pale. "What is that?" I knelt, my engineer's mind trying to analyze the scene, to find a logical cause. The ground around the carcass was a mess of churned up leaves and dirt.
And in that mess were tracks. They were not bear tracks. They were not wolf tracks. They were huge. Each print was the size of a dinner plate. They were canine, clearly, with 4 distinct toes and a large pad. But they were spaced far apart in a staggered line. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing. It was a bipedal gait. Whatever made these tracks walked on 2 legs. "Art," Cal said, his voice tight. "Look at this." He was pointing at a nearby pine tree. About 8 feet up the trunk, there were deep gouges in the bark. 3 parallel slashes, each as deep as my thumb. Whatever had made them possessed incredible strength and reach. We just stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into our bones, staring at the impossible evidence in front of us. Brian's story about the knocking, my experience with the scraping, and now this. A pattern was forming, and it was one that had no place in the world I knew.
"We need to get the kids and leave," Cal said finally, his voice flat. "Now." "We can't," I said, my mind racing. "We need to finish my cabin. The pipes will freeze and burst if we don't drain them. It'll be $1,000 in damage." It sounds stupid now, my focus on practicality in the face of such a thing. But my brain was clinging to normalcy, to procedure, clinging to problems I knew how to solve. "To hell with the pipes, Art." "No, listen," I insisted, trying to stay calm, to be the rational one. "It's daylight. Whatever this is, it seems to be nocturnal. We work fast. We get my place buttoned up by noon, and we're on the road by 1. We'll be out of these woods before the sun even starts to set. We stick together. No one goes anywhere alone." Cal hesitated, then nodded slowly. He trusted my judgment. It's a trust I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. We went back to the cabin. We told Brian and Alyssa that we'd found a deer killed by a bear, a big one, and that we needed to be careful and work quickly. We didn't tell them about the tracks. We didn't tell them it had been torn in half. There was no point in causing a panic. But the mood was gone. The easy camaraderie was replaced by a tense, quiet efficiency. Brian stopped making jokes. Alyssa stuck close to her father. We worked through the morning, a frantic energy propelling us. We drained the water heater, opened the taps, poured antifreeze into the drains. I was on a ladder outside, securing the last of the heavy wooden shutters over the loft window, when I felt it. The distinct, prickling sensation of being watched. I paused, hammer in hand, and slowly scanned the tree line. The forest was still, utterly, unnaturally still. No squirrels chattering, no blue jays scolding, just a dead, heavy silence. And then I saw it. For just a second, a flicker of movement between 2 thick pines, maybe 200 yards away. It wasn't an animal's movement. It wasn't the dart of a deer or the lumber of a bear. It was a lateral shift. A dark shape, tall and broad, moving sideways to keep a tree between us. I only caught a glimpse of a massively broad shoulder covered in dark, matted fur and a head that was too high off the ground. It was there, and then it was gone. I nearly fell off the ladder. My heart was pounding against my ribs. It was real. It was out there, and it was watching us. I scrambled down, my hands shaking. "Cal!" I yelled. "Inside! Everyone inside, now!" They saw the look on my face and didn't argue. We all piled into the cabin, and I slammed the heavy door and threw the deadbolt. I went to the gun rack by the fireplace and pulled down my .30-06 hunting rifle. Cal was right behind me, taking his 12-gauge shotgun. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice low and steady as he broke the shotgun open to check the shells. "It's out there," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I hated that. I hated the fear. "In the tree line. It's watching us." Brian's face was ashen. "What is? The bear?" "It's not a bear," I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "It was standing on 2 legs." Alyssa let out a small, choked sob. Cal put a hand on her shoulder. "Okay," he said, his voice taking on a command tone. "Okay, we're secure in here. The doors are solid, the windows are shuttered. We're safe." But I knew better. I had built this cabin. I knew its strengths, and I knew its weaknesses. It was built to keep out storms and bears, not something that could think, not something that was patient. As the afternoon wore on, the sky grew overcast. A premature dusk began to settle over the forest. The cabin grew darker. We didn't turn on the lights. We sat in the gloom, listening. For hours, there was nothing but the sound of our own breathing and the occasional sigh of the wind. The tension was suffocating. We were a small island of humanity under siege by an unknown enemy. The first sound came just after what I judged to be 6 o'clock. It was a soft thump against the back wall. Then another. We all froze. Cal and I raised our weapons, pointing them towards the rear of the cabin. The thumping stopped. Then we heard footsteps. Heavy. The crunch of frozen leaves under an immense weight. It was circling the cabin. Slowly, deliberately. We could track its progress by the sound. It walked the perimeter, a slow, predatory patrol. Then, the footsteps stopped directly in front of the main door. Silence. A long, drawn-out silence that was worse than any noise. I was standing near the door, my rifle pressed to my shoulder. I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. Then, a new sound started. A low, wet, sniffing sound, right at the crack between the door and the frame. It was smelling us, taking our scent, learning who was inside. Brian made a gagging noise, and I shot him a fierce look to be quiet. The sniffing continued for what felt like an eternity. Then the doorknob began to turn, slowly, back and forth. It was testing the lock. My mind reeled, the sheer, horrifying intelligence of it. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. This was a thinking creature, a problem solver. It was examining our defenses. The knob stopped turning. There was a low growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate the very logs of the cabin. It wasn't the growl of a wolf or a bear. It was deeper, more guttural, filled with a resonant malice that felt ancient. Then it moved away. The footsteps receded, heading back towards the woods. We let out a collective, shaky breath. "It's gone," Alyssa whispered. "No," I said, not lowering my rifle. It's just thinking. I was right. About 10 minutes later, the attack began. It wasn't at the door. It was at the front wall to the right of the door. A massive, deafening boom shook the entire cabin. A picture fell off the wall and shattered on the floor. Alyssa screamed. It was the sound of something colossal being thrown against the logs. Another boom, this time right next to the shuttered window. The wood of the shutter groaned, splintering. "It's trying to break through the wall," Cal yelled over the noise. It was using a battering ram, a log, a huge rock, something. I peered through the small peephole in the door. In the dying gray light, I could finally see it clearly. It stood in the middle of my yard, about 20 feet away. My mind simply refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It was at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. The shoulders were immense, a solid block of muscle and matted dark gray fur. Its arms were too long for its body, hanging down past its knees. The hands were shockingly human-like, with 5 long digits, but they ended in thick, black claws. It was standing on 2 powerful canine legs, bent at the wrong angle, like a wolf's, ending in massive paws. And the head. God, the head. It was the head of a monstrous wolf or a German shepherd, with a long, powerful snout and erect, pointed ears. But the eyes were not animal. They were set forward, not on the sides of its head, and they glowed with a faint, predatory yellow light. They were filled with a terrifying, calculating intelligence. It held a large rock in its hands, a boulder that must have weighed over 100 pounds. As I watched, it heaved the rock effortlessly and threw it against the cabin wall again. Boom. "It's a monster," Brian stammered, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. "It's not real." "It's real enough," Cal grunted, chambering around in his shotgun. "And it's trying to get in." The assault on the wall continued. I knew the logs were thick, but a sustained attack like that would eventually break them. I had to do something. "Cal," I said, my voice tight, "the window shutter. The next time it throws the rock, I want you to open the shutter just a crack and fire. Aim for the center of mass. Just scare it. Drive it back." "You got it," he said, moving to the window. We waited. The creature in the yard let out another of those rumbling growls. It hefted the rock again. Boom! The moment the rock hit, Cal slid open the small latch on the inside of the shutter and pushed it open a few inches. He shoved the barrel of the 12-gauge through the gap and fired. The roar of the shotgun inside the cabin was deafening. The creature staggered back, letting out a roar of its own, a sound of pure fury and pain. It dropped the rock. Cal had hit it. I saw through the peephole that a dark patch was spreading on its chest, but it didn't run. It looked at its wound, then looked at the cabin, and its eyes narrowed. The intelligence in that gaze was the most terrifying thing I have ever seen. It wasn't just a wounded animal. It was an enemy that had just been challenged. It didn't charge. It did something worse. It turned and melted back into the darkness of the trees. "Did you get it?" Brian asked, his voice hopeful. "I hit it," Cal said, reloading the shotgun with trembling hands. "It's bleeding." We waited. The silence returned, heavier and more menacing than before. Minutes stretched into an hour. Nothing. No footsteps, no growls, no more rocks hitting the wall. "Maybe it went off to die," Alyssa said, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't count on it," I muttered, my eyes scanning the dark perimeter of the room. This thing was smart. It had been testing the front. Now it knew we could shoot back from there. So it would try something else. It was a tactical problem. It was flanking us. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the back of the cabin, from the small attached woodshed where I kept my firewood and tools. It had circled around while we were focused on the front. It was using diversionary tactics. "The back door!" I yelled. The woodshed had a simple plank door that led into the cabin's kitchen area. It was nowhere near as strong as the main door. Cal and I rushed towards it just as we heard the sound of splintering wood. The creature was tearing the outer shed door off its hinges. "Brian, Alyssa, push the table against this door, now!" I commanded. They scrambled to move the heavy oak dining table, shoving it against the kitchen door. I stood beside it, rifle ready. Cal took up a position on the other side. We could hear it in the woodshed now. The heavy breathing, the sound of it knocking things over. Then, a terrible, rending sound. It was clawing at the interior door. Deep gouges appeared in the thick pine planks. Chips of wood flew into the kitchen. It was then that Brian broke.
He had been a cocky city kid, then a terrified boy, and now he was just a bundle of pure panic. He looked from the door being torn apart to the front of the cabin, which was now quiet. His eyes darted to the truck keys, which were on a hook by the main door. "I'm getting out of here," he whispered, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Brian, no," Cal hissed. "Stay here. It's what it wants." But he wasn't listening. He saw a gap, a chance. He believed the creature was occupied at the back. He made a mad dash for the front door. "Don't!" I yelled, but it was too late. He fumbled with the deadbolt, threw the door open, and sprinted out into the darkness, heading for the truck. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, from the side of the cabin, a black shape exploded out of the darkness. It was impossibly fast. It moved not with a run, but with a series of massive, ground-eating bounds. It intercepted Brian before he was halfway to the truck. We saw the long arm swing, a flash of claws in the dim light. Brian let out a single, high-pitched scream that was cut off with a sickening wet crunch. The creature didn't even break its stride. It grabbed him, lifted him off the ground as if he weighed nothing, and disappeared back into the black woods. The front door was still wide open. Alyssa was screaming, a continuous piercing sound of pure horror. Cal stood frozen, his face a canvas of shock and agony. He had just watched his nephew die. The sound of clawing at the back door had stopped. It had what it wanted, or at least part of what it wanted. I slammed the front door shut and threw the bolt, my body shaking uncontrollably. Cal finally snapped out of his trance, a terrible, guttural roar of grief and rage tearing from his throat. He ran to the front door and started to fumble with the lock. "Cal, no, don't go out there." I grabbed his arm. "It took him. It took my boy," he screamed, trying to shake me off. He was a big man, and in his rage he was strong. "He's gone, Cal. You can't help him now. We have to protect Alyssa," I yelled, putting myself between him and the door. The sound of my voice, the mention of his daughter's name seemed to penetrate his grief. He sagged against the wall, the shotgun clattering from his numb fingers. Alyssa was huddled in a corner, rocking back and forth, her hands over her ears. The cabin was a wreck. The furniture was overturned, shattered glass was on the floor, and the back door was deeply scarred. But we were alive. 3 of us. The silence that descended now was the silence of a tomb. We knew it was still out there, and we knew it would be back. The hunt was not over. Hours passed. We huddled together in the center of the room, away from the walls. Cal had picked up his shotgun, his face set in a grim, determined mask. The grief had been replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Alyssa had stopped screaming and was now just shivering, her eyes vacant with shock. I was trying to think. My engineer's brain was desperately trying to solve the problem. The cabin was a fortress, but a fortress under siege eventually falls. We couldn't stay here. Morning was still hours away. Then it started again. Not a violent assault this time, something far more insidious. A voice. From outside, near the front window, it was a woman's voice, crying softly. "Help me, please. I'm hurt." Alyssa's head snapped up. "There's someone out there." "Shh," Cal ordered, his hand tightening on the shotgun. "That's not a person." The voice was thin and reedy, but it was undeniably human-sounding. It was mimicking. It was trying to lure us out. It had seen Alyssa. It knew there was a woman in here. My stomach turned. The sheer cunning of the thing was beyond anything I could have imagined. It was learning, adapting its tactics. "Please, it's so cold," the voice wailed. "Don't listen," I whispered, my own voice hoarse. "It's a trick." The voice cried for a few more minutes, then fell silent. It was replaced by a new sound, a heavy, rhythmic ramming against the main door. Thud, thud, thud. It had abandoned stealth. It was coming in. It was using its own body as a battering ram. The thick oak door shuddered with each impact. A crack appeared near the lock. "It's coming through!" Cal yelled. "Art, what do we do?" My mind raced. The windows were shuttered. The walls were thick. The weak point was the door. We couldn't hold it. But there was one other way out. "The fireplace!" I shouted. "The roof!" The fireplace was massive, built of fieldstone with a wide chimney. The flue was large enough for a man to squeeze through if he had to. It was a chimney sweep's access. From the roof, we could maybe get to the trees, get away from the immediate vicinity of the cabin. It was a desperate, insane plan. "Cal, you give me covering fire." "I'll get Alyssa up there first, then I'll follow. Then you come up." I laid out the plan in sharp, clipped sentences. "No," he said, his voice deadly calm. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw a terrible finality. "You get her out of here, Art. I'm not leaving Brian." He didn't mean he was going to find him. He meant he was going to avenge him. "Cal, don't be a fool. We can all make it." Crack! A large piece of the door splintered inward. We could see the dark fur, the snout, pushing through the hole. "There's no time to argue," he said, shoving me towards the fireplace. "Go. That's an order." He was a civilian, an electrician, but in that moment, he was the bravest soldier I had ever known. He turned to face the door, raised the shotgun to his shoulder, and took a deep breath. I didn't waste his sacrifice. I grabbed the terrified, almost catatonic Alyssa and dragged her to the fireplace. I boosted her up into the smoky darkness of the flue. "Climb," I ordered. "Don't stop climbing until you see the sky." She obeyed, her limbs scrambling for purchase on the rough stone. Behind me, the door finally gave way with a deafening crash. It flew off its hinges and slammed into the dining table. The creature filled the doorway. It was even bigger up close, a horrifying silhouette of muscle and rage against the gray night. Cal didn't hesitate. He fired the shotgun. The blast hit the creature square in the chest. It roared and staggered back, but it didn't fall. It swiped at him with a clawed hand, and I heard Cal cry out in pain. He fired again and again. I turned and scrambled up into the chimney, the sounds of the life and death struggle echoing below me. I heard the shotgun clatter to the floor. I heard Cal's final, defiant yell, and then a series of terrible, wet, tearing sounds. And then silence. I climbed, my hands raw, my lungs burning from the soot and the exertion. I pushed Alyssa up ahead of me. We emerged onto the steep pitch of the roof, into the frigid night air. I didn't look back. I didn't look down. I guided her to the edge of the roof that faced away from the yard, towards the thickest part of the forest. We slid off the edge, dropping 10 feet into a snow-dusted thicket of bushes. We ran. We ran without looking back.
We crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear it. Behind us, the sound of something immense crashing through the woods. It was coming after us. I grabbed Alyssa's hand and pulled her along, my legs pumping, my body fueled by pure adrenaline and terror. We ran for what felt like an eternity, the forest a black, suffocating maze. We didn't stop until we stumbled out of the tree line and onto the hard-packed gravel of the main logging road. We were miles from the cabin. The sky to the east was just beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. We collapsed onto the road, gasping for air, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and shock. We were alive. We had escaped. But the cost was unimaginable. We walked for another hour before we heard the rumble of an engine, a logging truck making its first run of the day. The driver, a big man with a kind, weathered face, took one look at our torn clothes, our scratched faces, and the sheer horror in our eyes, and helped us into his cab without a word. He drove us to the nearest town, to the sheriff's office. I tried to give a statement. I tried to be the rational engineer. I described the events chronologically, factually. I told them about the tracks, the deer, the siege on the cabin. I told them about Brian and Cal. They listened with a kind of weary patience. The sheriff, a man named Miller, kept nodding, his face impassive. Alyssa was taken to the hospital, sedated and treated for shock and exposure. They sent a deputy and a couple of state troopers out to the cabin.
They were gone for most of the day. When the deputy returned, he looked tired. He told me they had found the site. The cabin was a wreck. They found Cal's body inside. What was left of it? They found Brian's remains scattered in the woods. The official story was already being written in the deputy's tired eyes. "Looks like a bear attack, Mr. Vance," he said, not quite meeting my gaze. "A big one, and a bold one. Sometimes they get sick or old and they get aggressive. It's a tragedy." "That was not a bear," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of grief and anger. "I saw it. There were tracks. It was walking on two legs. It used tools. It tried to talk." He just sighed. "You've been through a terrible ordeal. The mind plays tricks when you're in shock. We found bear tracks, lots of them, all over the place." They covered it up, or they simply refused to see what was right in front of them. The official cause of death for Cal Peterson and Brian Keller was listed as animal attack, perpetrator unknown, but presumed to be a black bear. My testimony was dismissed as the ramblings of a traumatized old man. There was no investigation. The case was closed. A few days later, as I was preparing to leave that town forever, an old Forest Service ranger approached me outside the motel. He was grizzled, with eyes that had seen a lot of lonely winters. He didn't give his name. "You're the fella from the Vance cabin," he stated more than asked. I nodded. He looked around, then lowered his voice. "I've been working these woods for 40 years. Heard a lot of stories. Seen a few things I can't explain. You're not the first to lose people out on that ridge. My advice to you? Sell that land. Don't ever come back. Some places are just bad." He turned and walked away before I could ask him anything else. He was the only one. The only person who acknowledged, even in that veiled way, that what I had seen was real. It was a small, cold comfort. I sold the cabin. I never went back. I live in the city now, surrounded by concrete and the noise of traffic. I can't stand the woods anymore. I can't stand silence. Every time it gets too quiet, I hear it. The scraping on the wall, the guttural growl, Cal's last shout. I have nightmares every night. I see those intelligent, glowing yellow eyes. I see Brian being snatched into the darkness. I feel the weight of Cal's sacrifice. He traded his life for ours, and I have to carry that. I spend my nights online now,
in forums and on websites that people would call crazy. I read the stories. A hunter in Wisconsin, a couple in the Michigan Upper Peninsula, a trucker in rural Pennsylvania. Their stories are all different, but the creature is the same. The impossible anatomy, the terrifying intelligence, the sheer malice.
We are a quiet, scattered community of survivors. People who have looked behind the curtain of reality and seen the monster hiding there. We are all isolated by a truth that no one else can bear to believe. I am telling you this story not for attention, not for belief. I am telling you this for Cal and for Brian. Their deaths were not a random animal attack. They were killed by something that exists in the dark spaces on the map, something ancient and malevolent. I am telling you this as a warning. The world is not as safe as you think it is. The wilderness is not your playground, and if you are ever deep in the woods at night, and you hear a rhythmic knocking, or you feel the unnatural silence that means you are being watched, do not rationalize, do not investigate, run.